folks. Hey, folks. Hey, folks. Hey, folks. All right, let me get into some of your questions. I'm going to jump into things today. Really interesting week that we have had here. Let me start with a bunch of questions and try and pull them together. Hey, folks. Welcome to Politics Chat for Thursday, September 25th. I'm sorry I can't do this live, which I always prefer, but I have something I can't move later on today. So let me just get right into your questions rather than seeing where you all are from. First of all, a lot of people have had questions about the congressional resolutions condemning the murder of right-wing activist Charlie Kirk. Some people wanted to know why Democrats voted for them. Others wanted to know why Democrats voted against them or abstained. And the answer to this is that it's pretty commonplace for both chambers of Congress to pass a resolution condemning political violence in its wake. And the Charlie Kirk murder certainly appeared at the time to be a political murder, although, we don't know because we still don't have information out there yet from a trial or even evidence. So it's very commonplace to condemn a political event like that. And normally those condemnations are nonpartisan. They go out of their way to make sure they're nonpartisan, and they just pass through each chamber. And that's in fact what happened in the Senate. There was a fairly nonpartisan resolution that passed unanimously. In the House, though, the Republicans tried to turn it into a weapon against the House Democrats. And so what they did is they turned the resolution into a political statement that, for example, said that Charlie Kirk was a courageous American patriot and that he was a fierce defender of the American founding, things that Democrats were not comfortable agreeing to, considering his extraordinarily divisive language and racist and homophobic language. So, and misogynistic language as well. So the Democrats either sucked it up and agreed to it, recognizing that their districts would be angry if they didn't, or some abstained, or I'm not sure if some opposed or not. I think probably they just abstained. But that's why there was that weird thing going on. In fact, these resolutions happen all the time, and usually they are nonpartisan. In this case, the insertion of partisanship into the resolution meant that it was a political test for Democrats and they had to choose which way to jump. So that was what was happening with that. Some other questions you've asked about, and that is, first of all, the election of Adelita Grijalva in Arizona, and what will that do to the investigations surrounding, or the issues surrounding the release of information about the investigation into convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, because she will provide the 218th vote for what's called a discharge petition. And you think I'm in the weeds now, just wait till you see where I'm going. What that means is this: if there is a measure that a member of the House of Representatives wants to get to the floor over the objections of the House leadership, they can advance what's called a discharge petition. In order to do that, they have to have a certain number of votes. And in this case, she will provide the final vote that those pushing the petition need. That means that all the Democrats are on board, and right now 4 Republicans to bring the number up to 218, which is what they need. And once they have those signatures, what happens is that the supporters have to go and say, we want this to happen, and they get 7 they have 7 legislative days before they can announce that they are going to offer the discharge petition motion. And then once they have done that, the speaker is required to stage a vote on that proposal within 2 legislative days. And if all this took place, theoretically, the discharge petition could pass the House during the week of October 20th. But there's a lot of shenanigans that can take place before that. First of all, one of the things that the House has done under House Speaker Mike Johnson, a Republican of Louisiana, is for the purposes of another thing that had to have legislative action within a certain number of days. What they did is they simply passed a measure saying that for the purposes of that particular measure, the House would not consider any more days, the legislative days, which I actually wrote about at the time because I thought that would catch people's attention for Congress to say a day is not a day, but they could do that. They could also further delay the swearing in of the new Representative Grijalva because right now what Johnson has done in order to jam the Senate and the Democrats on the funding of the government is simply not to be in session. So the House and the Senate as well are not in session this week. Theoretically, they would come back on Monday and they'd be there on Tuesday as well, the 29th and the 30th of September. Johnson has said they're not going to do that. So what that means is that they will not meet again at least until the 1st of October. And there is language suggesting that in fact the official return of the House will not be until October 7th. So you can see how they can string this out, and I expect that we will see that. If you care about the release of the Epstein files, as I do pretty profoundly, this is something you're going to want to keep pressure up on because clearly Johnson and the White House are trying to run out the clock on that. They don't want that information to come out. So yes, her vote is the vote that is necessary, but getting her in a position to be able to vote is going to be delayed, is my suspicion. And once she produces that vote, and again, other people could change their votes at that point, although right now there's no sign of that happening, then there are ways that Johnson could stretch out the calendar to say that, for the purposes of this petition, a legislative day will not be a legislative day, which again, I just find absolutely mind-boggling. You shouldn't be able to say a day is not a day, as far as I'm concerned. All right. So here's the other big question that people are asking about. People asked if I think the Epstein files have been destroyed, and my answer to that is maybe, but an awful lot of people have seen them at this point and have had their hands on them. So there's a lot of people who know what's in there, and as it becomes more valuable to have them in public versus having them kept private, I suspect we're going to hear from more of those people. I don't know, of course, but that's one of the things about the historical record in the modern era is it's very hard to make it go away. There's always somebody who knows something. And that's not true in the first half of the 19th century and before that, when if you wanted to make something go away, you could burn your papers. Now think about how many people know anything in the modern world, and so I'm not entirely certain that that's I don't know. The bottom line is I don't know, but it doesn't keep me up at night. So let me tell you a lot of questions about the potential government shutdown on the horizon and what is going on with that. Because this is, as former President Joe Biden would have said, a BFD. And not simply because a government shutdown is always a BFD, but because of what it signifies in this moment. So a government shutdown happens when the government doesn't have funding. And that's different. I've talked to you 1,000 times about the debt ceiling. These are not the same thing. It's all about money, but it's about money in very different ways. What has happened is that the fiscal year for the United States government runs out at the end of September 30th. That's the end of the fiscal year. Now, theoretically, Congress is supposed to have passed a budget. Is supposed to have passed appropriations, of course, long ago before this, not now. They're supposed to have done it long ago. But Congress always these days has a problem passing appropriations bills. Now, when they pass appropriations bills, Remember, there are 12 of them. It's not just one bill. There are 12 bills that correspond to each of the appropriations subcommittees. So there are appropriations committees in each house of Congress, and then there are subcommittees in that. And those subcommittees then take a look at their numbers and say what they're willing to pay, and take a look at all the caps and the things they have to do and so on when they're putting together their appropriations measures. And in the case of this particular Congress, they haven't passed any. Now, this Congress is the least productive in the history of the United States. It's done virtually nothing except pass that omnibus bill through the budget reconciliation measure, which meant that it did not need any Democratic buy-in, which at the time they thought was a great idea, but now has got them in real trouble because they own the whole freaking thing, including all the mistakes they made in it. And they also passed a continuing resolution with the help of Democratic votes to, a continuing resolution is if you haven't passed the appropriations bills and you're running out of money, they can pass something called a continuing resolution that continues the funding of the government at the levels that it has been funded up until then. And that happened back in March, which you may or not remember. Anyway, the appropriations have not gone through, so the government is funded only through midnight or 11:59 or whatever on September 30th of this year, which is 5 days away. So normally, let me actually tell you about how this has gone, and then I'll tell you what normally happens. Okay, so what happened was on September 19th, the House of Representatives pushed through only with well, no, that's not true. There was one Democrat who voted for it and two Republicans who voted against it. But they passed through a continuing resolution to say we're going to keep the government funded at this level until I think it's March of 2026. And we'll spend the next several months hashing out what is going to go into those appropriations bills. Again, which were supposed to be done by now. I'm not going to editorialize, I promise, although it's killing me. Some of us have to live with deadlines. By the way, do you know where we get the idea of a deadline? I mean, this is sort of horrible. So turn this off if you, or go get a cup of tea or something if you don't want to hear it. But in the Andersonville prison camp in the American Civil War, they were very short of wood to build palisades. And so they did have a wooden fence around the prison camp, but they had a number of feet within it, a string. Sometimes it was there and sometimes it got broken, that if you crossed over it, looking as if you were going to go for the palisade and try to climb over, that the guards in the corners would shoot you. So if you cross that line, that was you were going to be shot and killed. So they began to call that the deadline. And that's at least in American history where we get the idea of a deadline. So every time I sort of say the word deadline, I think of that and recognize that me not finishing an article in time is nowhere near the same thing. I'm more of the principle of that cartoon that says, I love deadlines. I love the rushing sound they make as they whoosh on by. Anyway, on the 19th of September, the House of Representatives passed a continuing resolution. And it went to, which if you think about the date, that was last Friday, because again, remember, Congress is not in session this week. The Senate took it up and it didn't pass. The Senate, a number of Republicans didn't vote for it. I think it was 2 Republicans didn't vote for it. The Democrats didn't vote for it. And what they were saying to the House is, this ain't going to fly. This is not the way we're going to do this. We're not just going to do a continuing resolution. But Speaker Johnson, who's a very close ally of Donald Trump, said, whoop, we're out of here. We're not only are we going to take next week off, which is in the calendar, which you can look at online, by the way, we're not coming back Monday or Tuesday. So we're not going to come back until after this deadline. So if you want to fund the government, you have to accept the continuing resolution that we just put through. And it was a relatively clean one, they call it, because what it said was that they were going to keep funding the government with the addition of security measures for a number of lawmakers. The Senate said, "This ain't happening." And now they got a problem. The Republicans have a problem in the Senate because in the Senate, if you remember, and I've talked about this a lot too, they have this institution called the filibuster. And the way you should think about the filibuster is just what it means is that there is no rule to make a senator stop talking. The House had to come up with one in the early 19th century. So you can't pull that in the House, but you can pull it in the Senate. And this is one of the things that former Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell used to extraordinary effect to stop anything from going through the Senate is simply by using the filibuster, because it has been modernized to the point where rather than having to actually stand up and talk, the way Strom Thurmond did, for example, to stop the passage of the 1957, I believe it was, Civil Rights Act. Not that it worked, but that was his attempt. That was the thing that Senator Cory Booker spoke for longer than that this year. If you remember, that's one of the reasons Cory Booker's speech was got a lot of press, is because before that, Strom Thurmond trying to stop civil rights was the longest speech in Senate history. Booker was not filibustering. He was simply speaking, but that's what those things were doing there. Anyway, because they have this filibuster, you don't have to stop someone to stop make someone there's no way to make someone stop speaking, and because it is modernized, so all you have to do is say, if you go forward, I will filibuster. You don't actually have to do it. In order to get anything through the Senate, you have to get 60 votes. So that being the case, the Republicans don't have 60 votes. They have 52 votes. So they're going to need 8 Democratic votes in order to get anything through the Senate. Now, here's a problem. One of the problems is that the Republicans have simply refused to talk to the Democrats. They're not negotiating. They're not trying to come up with anything. Trump has told them not to talk to the Democrats. They're just saying to the Democrats, suck it and vote for this, because we know you hate government shutdowns because it hurts people, and we think you're going to do this. Well, but here's the problem for the Republicans. That budget reconciliation bill they passed back in July, that thing they called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the problem with that is that it has a number of extraordinarily unpopular things in it. And one of the things they did, some people liked it in the Republican Party and some people didn't. But if you remember, the members of the Republican Party have never liked the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And one of the things they did in that budget reconciliation bill was they stripped out the tax credits that make it possible for people who are between the 100% and 400% of the federal poverty level to afford to buy health care on the Affordable Care Act markets. Now, that will strip, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, that'll strip about 4.2 million people off of health care. But what it will also do is it's sending healthcare premiums through the freaking roof. If you have not gotten yours yet, if this affects you, you're going to be horrified when you see these measures come in. And it especially at a time when the economy is slowing, there are fewer jobs, and inflation is going up pretty dramatically. A lot of people are suddenly going to be facing this fall without being able to afford health care. And so what the Democrats have said is that we're not going to sign anything unless we have ironclad commitments in writing that we're going to put these subsidies back in place, because it's not only hurting the 4.2 million people who are going to lose their subsidies because they can't afford them. And it's not only going to hurt the people who are going to be kicked off Medicaid, which they've also asked to be addressed, but it's going to hurt all regular Americans who have to deal with healthcare premiums, because they're all going through the roof. Because what happens is, without these subsidies, healthier people are dropping out of the markets, and that means the pool that's left is sicker, and that means that it costs more to insure those people in those pools. That's the whole point of how Obamacare, which, by the way, came from a Republican think tank, in place of healthcare for everybody, which is what liberals wanted. The that whole market idea just lost all the people who are kind of buoying it up. So the Democrats have said, this ain't freaking happening. We're not going to do this, because every time we say we're going to negotiate with you and we'll give you a little rope, you use it to hang us. And we must stand firm on health care for people before we take anything else on, especially when you got Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in there as Secretary of Health and Human Services, who is really messing up the healthcare system in the United States. So the Democrats have said, absolutely, we're not going to do this. Okay, so what normally happens in a crisis like this, and these are very modern, by the way, what normally happens is there is a negotiation. Everybody comes up with something they can agree on. They pass a continuing resolution with whatever they've come up with. And it's never the whole thing. It's a little tweak here or there. And then it passes and people go forward and continue the negotiations. But in this case, I'm sorry, in the past, Republicans have often refused to do that because they want more cuts. And they're saying, oh, the Democrats are just doing what we always do that they get mad at is, they're slowing things down because they want stuff. But the Democrats have countered with, now, hang on a second. We don't want cuts. We want people to have health insurance. And this is something that we're willing to stand on. So they are standing firm on that. Now, so that's how it's supposed to go and goes in the past. But now we have a whole new monkey wrench in this moment. And this is why I said it's a BFD. And that's that you may have heard me talk before about the director of the Office of Management and Budget, probably something you haven't spent a great deal of your time thinking about in your lives. But it's really important right now because the director of the Office of Management and Budget is a man named Russell Vought. Russell Vought is a fervent Christian nationalist who believes that we are in what he calls a post-constitutional moment. He believes that the U.S. government has been completely corrupted by what he calls the left, and that means anybody who is not MAGA. And what they have done is they have used that government to create this secular world in which people are not following God and who are relying on the government, and it's doing all sorts of stuff that he doesn't want it to do. He wants to strip it all the way back to at least the 1920s, if not before. And you see his fingerprints all over the Department of Government Efficiency, for example, where billionaire Elon Musk was the head theoretically, but the real cuts were coming from Russell Vought. And you can read about what he cares about because he was one of the key architects of Project 2025. Anyway, last night he released to a whole bunch of newspapers the news that if the government shuts down, that the government is just going to fire everybody. And that this is exactly what he wants. He wants to get rid of the modern government. And he was expecting that, or at least probably trying, I shouldn't say what he was expecting, who knows, I'm not in his head. He was clearly trying to put pressure on the Democrats to go, oh God, we're in trouble now. We better go ahead and do this because then all our people get fired. That has not happened. The Democrats have said, what difference does it make? You're firing people anyway. And, we've got all these cases where there's been this stripping of the US government, and then they're court cases and you lose them all. And all of a sudden you have to beg people to come back. Right now, that's happened today. There's a major rehiring underway in one of the government agencies where the people who were fired by DOJ essentially got 7 months paid vacation because now they're being begged to come back because they cut too deeply. And the Democrats have said, we're going to have the showdown now because we don't want the government that Russell Vought, who is an unelected bureaucrat, is trying to force down the American people's throats. And this is increasing now the pressure on the Republicans who recognize that, in fact, those cuts to health care are really unpopular. And a lot of Republicans actually would like to fix that, what they consider a mistake. Other Republicans who want to get rid of the Affordable Care Act are like, don't even think about going there. We're not going to take that on because we want to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. So what you are really seeing in this moment is a showdown between the extreme radical MAGA mindset, the Christian nationalist mindset. And I believe Russell Vought would be one of the first to call himself an extremist. He has called for a new American revolution, saying this is a way to get rid of the modern government and to start again with a new old one, if you will. The people around him consider this a revolution. You have a showdown between that and those of us who support the modern American government. Not I don't think anybody would say it's perfect. I'm actually quite looking forward to seeing changes in it going forward among things over things like healthcare, for example, and daycare and restoring cancer research, and I could keep on going. But what you're seeing here is this struggle between those who want to completely slash the federal government and get rid of all or almost all non-discretionary spending, and those of us who are like, no, we actually quite like the EPA, and we quite like having our airplanes stay in the sky, and we quite like cancer funding and education and healthcare and all the things that we think are important that they are trying to get rid of. So what's going to happen going forward is you're seeing this showdown. I would speak up if I were you, but you're also going to see people really calculating about what parts of the federal government they think are important. Now, in a shutdown, the non-discretionary spending and the things that the executive branch thinks are important continue to be funded. It's everything else that gets furloughed or, as vote says, cut. And we'll see how that plays out. But that's very much on the table right now. Um, what other things did you ask me about? Some other things that you should be looking at that I think are very emblematic in this moment of exactly what I just mentioned. And that is one of the things that if you step back a little bit and look, you will see that while the Trump administration has talked a great deal about cutting government spending, in fact, it hasn't cut government spending at all. In fact, government spending is up, not down. What they have done is they have cut the things that I've talked about. USAID, for example, which was less than 1% of the federal budget. Our foreign aid was part of our foreign aid. They have decimated that, and children are dying that counted on us for food. They've cut scientific research. They've cut education. They've cut the national parks. They've cut the EPA. They've cut all those pieces of the modern world that, as I've argued before, create wealth, not cash. That is, they make us people that are able to enjoy our time here on Earth and feel safe and able to work hard and prosper. Or at least that's the idea behind them. They've cut those things, but they've dramatically increased spending for border security, the construction of detention facilities, for immigrations and customs enforcement, or ICE. Those things are significantly more funded than they were before, quite significantly more. And one of the things that is worth paying attention to is that at the same time that the United States is cutting medical care, for example. A few days ago, the Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bennett, announced that the U.S. will be propping up Argentina's economy to the tune of $20 billion with a B, $20 billion. And that is because Javier Milei, who's the leader of Argentina, is a Trump ally. And what he has done there, the slashing through of government services and the cutting of the government and that sort of radical populist right idea, is precisely what the Trump administration has said it was going to do. And when Milei first did that, very early on, it did seem like it was going to work. Now, of course, it hasn't worked at all. People are incredibly frustrated. The peso is falling apart, and the economy is in huge trouble. So rather than looking at that and saying, oh boy, this doesn't look good, the U.S. is pumping money into Argentina to prop him up with the idea that his miracle is just around the corner. Although economists like Paul Krugman say, no, it's not. This is not going to work. And again, I'm a big believer in helping everybody around the world achieve a higher standard of living. But this sure just looks like pumping my tax dollars into supporting one of Trump's allies. So I'd pay attention, especially since Argentina did something else at this just before that this all took place. Argentina suspended its grain export tax, which meant that they undercut everybody else in the soybean market. And when they undercut everybody else in the soybean market, China, which does not want to buy soybeans from the United States because of Trump's tariff walls, promptly bought up all their soybeans. So American farmers cannot sell their soybeans. And now Trump is talking about bailing them out. So what you're seeing here is the use of American tax dollars essentially to support the radical right wing project of getting rid of the modern governments and replacing them with authoritarians. And that's, I know that sounds like it's really in the weeds. And you think, sitting there thinking, I don't really care about the Argentinian financial crisis. But you probably do care about the US government saying, well, we're going to prop them up with $20 billion. And which, maybe will be a great investment, but maybe won't. And that just seems like something that the president should not be able to do on his own, I don't think. Anyway, all right. So people also asked about something else very important, and that is what has happened to the alleged missing detainees from the immigration facility in the Everglades in Florida. I refuse to use that cutesy name for it. There is a report from the Miami Herald, I believe it is, that 800 of the people there are missing. And what they meant by that is that their names have fallen off official lists and their families don't know where they are. And that's the most anybody knows about that. I will say one of the things that this administration is now famous for, and you could write a whole book on this already, is what I would call obfuscation. If you keep just losing lists and saying to judges that they're in the wrong courtroom and forgetting to bring stuff and so on, what you've done is you've created a world where nobody can check up on you. And obviously, people should not have disappeared off any lists. If we are going to incarcerate people, we should know where they are and what happens to them. And one of the things that I think you are seeing, although it's, again, very, very hard to get your hands around it in terms of evidence, is the deportation to individuals to third party countries, and from there back to places where the US had given them security, saying they would not be returned to countries where their lives were at risk. What the US appears to be doing is taking those people and sending them to third countries where they don't have any reason not to go, and then turning around in those third countries, then render them back to the countries that the US guaranteed they would not go to, which is, when all this is over, the untangling and the court cases, and I hope the incarcerations are going to be epic, because this, of course, flies in the face of everything that the United States is supposed to stand for. All right, you had one other question. What was it? The news today about that Secretary of Defense, again, the White House, and Hegseth himself has asked everyone to call it the Department of War, but that name change can't happen without the sign-off of Congress, so it is still the Department of Defense, and that actually is a very different thing than the Department of War. The Department of Defense, under Pete Hegseth, has ordered military leaders from all around the world to come to a meeting next week in person in, where is it? It's in Bethesda, Maryland, I believe, at Quantico. I could be wrong about where it is. And everyone's asked me what's going on with that. I have no idea. What I will tell you is that it is highly unusual, and that it's worth, again, thinking about big picture stuff. We are incredibly privileged in the United States not to have had to worry overly about attacks on areas that we protect. And I'm trying to hedge that because, of course, the US has been attacked in a number of different places. But generally, we're able to keep a lid on the protection of the United States of America because we have a system. I always think of it as a net or a web in place that says that no matter what happens politically at home, or what happens with a hurricane, or with flooding or fires or whatever, there is a defense system in place that those people who would like to harm us recognize as a threat that they don't want to engage. And one of the things that worries people like me about the attacks on the individuals and the units that are supposed to be protecting our cybersecurity, for example, which the Trump administration has decimated, and with the firings within the military complex, for example, one of the things that is a problem with that is it destabilizes that net. And you never really want to destabilize that net. And one of the things that I've said before, but not for a while, is regardless of how you feel about any president that's in office, you don't want the president to be sick. You don't want the president to be demented. You don't want the president, God forbid, for something to happen to that person, because it creates instability in that system. It's one of the reasons that one of the leaders under Trump in his first term actually called his Chinese counterpart around the January 6th events and said, "Don't try anything. We're here. The government's stable." You don't want instability in that system. And usually a defense secretary will work to make that system stable, which is, one of the reasons that people were very unhappy with Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville for refusing to permit promotions within the military system, allegedly because he objected to the military's abortion policies, but almost certainly because he was trying to hold those positions open later on for Trump to fill. He pulled it again later on. People didn't pay it so much the second time. Anyway, you don't want to do that, regardless of what your political leanings are, because you do not want instability in our defense system. You don't want that simply because it makes people start poking the bear a little bit, right? Or makes people start testing. As you can see with Putin's attacks increasing on Ukraine after Trump keeps waffling, that has not ended up with everybody sitting around singing around a campfire. What it's done is it's made people start to poke. And you can see Vladimir Putin poking now with drones he's sending up into other people's airspace and so on. Calling all these people back to Washington is destabilizing. And so that's the only contribution I can make to this. I have no idea what they're up to, but I do know it's highly unusual, aside from everything else, because you don't want that kind of destabilization all around the world all at the same time. It's really quite eye-popping when it comes down to that. All right, I need to run. I'm sorry I couldn't do this live. I hope that was useful, and I will see you all at least by next Tuesday, although I might have something up my sleeve for tomorrow. We will see. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you again soon.